This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today's date is June the 12th, 2016, and as always, this is a program on the environment and pretty much anything else that affects the Champaign-Urbana area and Champaign County.
Okay. Busy week this week. Lots of things happening. I went to the memorial service for Lee Petrie Springer, and I thought that was a rather nice ceremony, simple at the Mennonite Church, and well adapted to all manner of philosophies, and simple, watching the sparrow. And Lee was a kind and generous and person, not without fairly strong opinions about how the community should work together. I sat next to a gentleman, Mr. Klein, I think. It wasn't quite Klein, it was like that. But he was from Goshen, and that's where most Mennonites go to school. And he had been a dean, I think. I didn't get to talk to him for too long, but just people interested, a lot of people from the East Mennonite community in Fisher, where Greg Springer grew up, and his family was there. He's lost not only his wife, Lee, but he's lost his two parents just in the last year. And the children were there, Henry, Ernie, and Miles, and then a niece, Erica. And those children have been associated with a more general community of children that played in the corner of Water Street in Urbana. It's a little street that it's not too far from Strawberry Fields, and it's right on the banks of this Boneyard Creek, and every once in a while it gets flooded, but it's a sort of community in itself. And Lee would walk her dog, and she would know people that she would meet along the way, and walk around Crystal Lake, and give goods and massages and do a lot of things for people. And there were lots of testimonials to that effect. And I think she will have an influence on the future of many people. She gardened, and we encountered her first long time ago with the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, and she was a part of that. And she had one leg in the community, the East Urbana community that's a little on the poverty side, over near Max Wrecking Yard. And one leg there and one leg in ERES and Heartland Pathways. And we enjoyed that situation. I talked to a lot of people that I knew from over the years, and we regenerated background. We had been concerned with the Pumpkin Vine, which was a railroad line that spun off a railroad at Leroy and ran through to Lotus, Bellflower, Lotus, Fisher, Dewey, Rantoul, Dillsburg, Penfield, Armstrong, and then into Indiana to Lafayette. It was abandoned in parts. 8 miles was kept between Rantoul and Dewey Fisher for grain, and so I recorded a lot of that removal of the railroad bed, and that was my first encounter with video work. There was a Banner video studio, and we could borrow cameras, and they were big at the time, and we had access to a printing device so that you could print onto the film. And eventually that was nixed, and the equipment at the old IGA was moved on to Parkland and other agencies that have done well with that sort of community access. But in the process, I got to know the people in the Fisher area, and I still know those people. They have churches in Fisher, but also in Gibson City and other places. They've originated mainly from the Peoria area rather than from the Amish area to the south, like Arcola. I left there to deliver styrofoam boxes to the cinema gallery, and the cinema gallery in turn gives many of those boxes to people who are working with ceramics and can pack things. Ice cream boxes and steak boxes are often designed to be coolers. They're very dense styrofoam, and they can be reused. So I've convinced local shops to leave their styrofoam boxes outside my place, and I will redistribute them. It's interesting that Goodwill will take them, and Habitat will take them. It's just that they're good and useful boxes, and they're better than the average cooler. Then I worked my way across the Kickapoo Trail. I'm not quite sure how to put visuals into this, but I started off at Route 130, kitty corner from Aldi's, and the trail has now been worked over. Trees have been removed, trees have been put into piles, trees have been shredded to mulch. The mulch has been removed. The stumps have been removed by a special saw that saws them up, and the track is ready for work. And that work concerns me because it is taking out some of the ballast and planing off the ballast mound, and that will remove quite a little bit of prairie. The reason for it is that EPA feels that the top few inches of the ballast will retain some of this the creosote that's been in rail ties, plus probably some other items that come out of clinker that comes out of steam engines and the like. I'm not quite sure how we decide how that corridor is polluting. I wonder if it's been checked out, whether it's been checked out for creosote in the middle of the trail or on the edge of the trail. Do they go down the edges of the trail? Do they sculpt this area? It's always much cheaper to plow the area and put it back according to the directions, rather than to take out portions and leave the sides intact. It's much more expensive. I ran into a guy named, I've got it here, Wintermiller, I think his name is. Yes, Wintermiller. And he worked with IDOT, and so I knew him 30 years ago. And he then worked with Cross Construction, which is the agency that has that contract for the 6 miles to St. Joe. He assured me that it is much cheaper to take a bulldozer with a laser beam and geographic information systems to plow and then remodel. That means that the prairie that's already crept up onto the ballast will be lost. Okay, so we have the problem of creosote, and that 10 inches of soil on top of the ballast will be removed and put to a landfill so that it is known where it is. And that's good safety or precaution for general public. That's better perhaps than just putting a rail trail down on a firm surface. But I would like to know what has leached into the edges, and I ran along that corridor at each intersection. I took photographs, and we'll include some of those, but we're finding that often our photographs, I say enough quickly that there's not room to put a photograph in.
You might go into a little bit of detail. You've mentioned that they're going to have to take out on the order of 10 inches of ballast because of creosote. You want to explain who it is that's made this decision and how the creosote got there?
Well, the decision-making is interesting. The plans usually come to us without a great deal of communication with the public. There are informational sessions, but usually when IDOT comes with an informational session, it's to tell you this is what we're going to do. If you have a question about a drive to your garage or something like that, we'll be able to change that. But basically, we're telling you what we're going to do. And it involves ASTO, which is the Union of Engineers or the Association of Engineers that controls this sort of planning. And it's almost like one size fits all. And I'm somewhat disappointed that the trail is so wide. It's like a highway. It's ADA accessible. And there's a lot of work involved in taking up 10 inches or whatever inches of tops ballast to send to the landfill. That means a lot of tandem trucks. That is where a lot of the cost of $3 million is in moving the ballast, and that's for your safety. But I've go to railroad seminars, and I've gotten to realize that although there's been a backing off from creosote in ties, there's some research to show that it is not as aggressive as it has been believed. And so we probably need to do a little bit more research to know whether there is actually creosote in that bed. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Well, so I was actually there when you were talking with the fellow from the Forest Preserve, I think, and he was actually saying that he was pretty sure that he had talked them into allowing them to take out less of the ballast. So basically, you're looking at what used to be a railroad line. They put wooden ties down to put the track over, and to help keep the ties from rotting away when they get wet, they filled them with creosote, which helps to slow down the decay of the material. The problem is the creosote over all of those years, or you're going back to the 1800s in some cases, the creosote from these ties would leach out into the dirt and other material that the ties had been put down on. As long as all it's being used for is trains running over it, that's not such a big deal. Now you're going to have human beings walking along this thing and riding their bicycles. So now the government steps in and says, guess what? That creosote is now a problem. It's a health hazard. So before they're going to allow the final trail to be opened, somebody has to go in, the people who are making this trail have to go in and take out enough of the top layer of dirt and such to make sure that they're getting the creosote out of there, and as you say, taking it to landfill. And then what they'll put down is fresh ballast, doesn't have any creosote because it was never used for train tracks. And then you'll
limestone.
Right, and then the chip limestone on top of all of that. So yeah, I'm assuming that they're going to put some dirt or something back on. Which isn't it weird? They're going to take out some number of inches of dirt, and then they'll probably end up putting some fresh dirt without creosote in it back down.
That's the disappointing thing, because the ballast is was made for a high weight rail, and so it's compacted, and it's a very good place for bicycles to ride without being disturbed. And since it is compacted, it doesn't make a lot of dust that is creosote filled. So there's some debate amongst the experts to see whether this is really of great concern. But it is a great concern if it's gotten a popular appeal to remove it. And so I do have some questions about whether we need to remove so much of the ballast and replace it with a recently soft chip limestone. It will be compacted. They have a roller which has a vibrator in it, and it can compact the soil and the chip limestone. So it'll be okay. And to some extent, we have to be tolerant of this. There are places, especially in Vermilion County, where the prairie has already grown over the railroad bed. And I really hope that in those situations, the bicycles can go onto a relatively low-used road adjacent, rather than to take up the Doris Westfield prairie, where she picked a whole bunch of the seed to make a prairie elsewhere. So I drove along and recognized the equipment, and recognized the interurban nearby that could be adjacent to, it is adjacent to, and could be a part of the trail and a part of prairie expansion. But I also watch the mowing. In some places, the mowing has mowed out a really good prairie, and I suspect in some cases has been herbicided. But I think that the Forest Preserve should be putting up signs to say, this is our territory, and please do not volunteer mow it. This is good prairie, and allow it to come back. There's also a huge bridge that goes over the Union Pacific, and the Union Pacific is not likely to allow a grade crossing over a high-speed line. So that means you have to have a bicycle way up and over the bridge. So I care about that, and I think that the routine planners routine enough that I would like to see that bridge put on a national docket so that architects and engineers could suggest how we get over that line, which is 2 lines at the moment, 1 line, 2 lines, and perhaps 3 lines. So you have to have I-beams that are long. Can you go up under the new bridge that's there, that's a road bridge, or can you add a bicycle lane on either side of the bridge? I'm thinking that there's some imagination that could work there, and I would like to tap national level people and make sort of a competition and perhaps even some sort of reward for design of a bridge under a bridge or bridge on a bridge, but certainly not a grade crossing just east of St. Joe. There are other places where the township, like Oakwood, has been mown out to the extent that it mows out prairie that is rather good. And I think in those cases the right-of-way should be flagged and the prairie allowed to come back. I don't think it's necessary to have a mile of mowing through a town. It's okay to have some mowing, but not mowing forever. And part of it is that we're so used to mowing, it's become a cultural thing. And the suggestion is to put a control on that. So I went on over to Vermilion County because it was their 50th anniversary. They were put together as a conservation district. Let me tell you that the conservation districts didn't exist until George Fell, who was a very interesting fellow. He grew up in Chicago, went to Rockford, noticed that the airport was going to expand and take out a whole bunch of prairie, more or less stopped that activity, and then went to Washington, bought an old house and a press, and joined up with a group that was minor at the time, and it became the Nature Conservancy. And so George Fell had a lot to do with that. He came back to Illinois and put together a research organization at Rockford that had a lot to do with putting through bills to the House. And one of those bills was to create conservation districts. The Vermilion County Conservation District was one of the first. So bully for George Fell, who's now passed 20 years ago, and we're talking about people who pass and then have an influence on other people for a long time, and George falls into that category. There was a guy named Ron Pennock, and he was at Rockford. He'd been hired there for a conservation district at an early age, and he thought it would be interesting to work with the conservation district in Vermilion County. So for a long time, he was the chief executive officer for a very new conservation district, and he put together a lot of parks, some of them well known now, Forest Glen, Kennecott County Park, Lake Vermilion, and Heron County Park is more recent, but Ron Pennock was very willing to work with people, and he employed a lot of people who are still with the park and have been there for 40 years or 30 years, and they'll be hard to replace because they've grown up creating this park system. Ron eventually came over to Champaign County. The county had a big park, and I'm trying to think of the man's name, but he was a cap and gown person, and he had gone to Europe and observed that there were parks, and he thought that you should have a park and select an area at Lake Park in near Mahomet. That park was run independently for a while, and by 1974 it was decided it should be Champaign County Forest Preserve. So Ron Pennock, once again looking at a start of a new organization or a remodeling of an old one, then he was CEO for Champaign County and for quite a number of years, and then eventually when Vermilion County needed a CEO again, he went back over there. So Ron Pennock is a name to be remembered in both Champaign and Vermilion counties. The present director is Ken Consis, and he has been there best part of 40 years. And they've really generated a lot of natural areas. There's a range there. Vermilion County is somewhat more rolling, and there's a terrain. So if you were in Indian times, you moved into Champaign County with your arrows and your plots of corn and melons and what have you. Then in wintertime, you moved back to Vermilion County. So for a long time, Vermilion County has been a place where Champaign County moves to do things with recreation and the like. It has also, underneath the pinnings, geological pinnings, Carboniferous age. There's faults, and so there's mining there. There's a compression of all those Carboniferous plants to make coal, and so there's mining there, and there's a mining history. There's a mining of deep mining where people came from Kentucky, and they would work the mine, but they would also farm plots of land to provide the food for donkeys and the like that were moving the coal out of those deep mines. Eventually, groups like Peabody took over and did strip mining. So they would plow the sod, remove the topsoil, take out the coal, and then move over and do the same. And they would start where there was a river, so there was already the overburden had been removed by the river, and they would do the same thing, and they would move the river so that they could get access to the coal. Some of those mines have closed. Some of the coal-burning power plants, there's one at Vermilion County, have retired and been closed. But when I went to the Palmer Center in Danville and walked into the an arena of booths, one of the booths is a conservation legal justification organization where they're looking at fly ash. So the original mines that provided the coal that was burned by a coal-burning plant that then dumped its leftover material from the burning of coal, dumped it on the riverbanks, and those riverbanks are beginning to erode, and that fly ash is going into the river, down the river to the Wabash and to the Ohio and to the Mississippi and into the Gulf. And that's the sort of material that gets eaten by fish, and it more or less destroys them and destroys the ecological balance. So this group had one booth. I'll run through some of the booths that were there. There's some archaeological extensions into Vermilion County. They relate to the Cahokia Mounds in East St. Louis that are national and international UNESCO type preservation. But these mounds go all the way up river corridors, and they pop up in Allerton Park. They pop up in a whole bunch of places. So there's people who were there that were discussing that sort of archaeology. The city of Danville has a Vermilion River running through it. So there were students there from landscape architecture who have been looking at the rivers and the railroads that cross, the roads that cross. How can you develop an interesting S-worthy park and connect it to the city and also allow for development around the area? So I will get a copy of the plans that they put forth. And they were talking. There were historical groups, and that interested me. The historians were Civil War enactment historians, but there were also people who were Celtic in background. We've done some sessions about the difference between entrepreneurial use of a new country and the native Indian use of the ecology. The entrepreneurs look at the tall forests, for instance, and they want the tall trees for masts for ships. So that's what they harvest, or that's what they grow. The Indian population that was being invaded tends to use those sorts of areas, and if there are 10 trees, they will take one perhaps, or they will grow things in relation to the natural history. Well, this gentleman was telling me that the Celtics, the Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, had more of an attitude that was like unto the Indians. They weren't as concerned about the overall ecology, but they certainly wanted to use it without abusing it. Well, that was interesting, but just after I came home, I listened to a program that was about a fellow named McMullen who went to Australia, and he was Celtic, and he had a lot of reputation in Australia for developing things. But there was also a little sidebar that some of the relatives encountered that wasn't quite so nice. So one of the relatives went to Australia to find out what really happened with the McMullen people. And truly, they had been invited in by Aboriginals that were well aware that the early settlers didn't always know how to work the landscape so that they could survive and have enough food in a rather dry climate. And so they were very generous. They were almost communistic in their sharing until they realized that they were being taken over. And then the settlers would grow things like sheep. And of course, the natural ecology people would help themselves to a sheep, and then they would be hung and strung up, and there would be massacres, and it was very sad for the Aboriginals. So, yes, there is a balance between entrepreneurial invasion of a country and the natural use of it. Not to say that the native people that are there to start with don't always have ambitions about doing things that might not be ecologically sound, but they're much more strong. And the entrepreneurial people come in with manifest destiny that more or less says that God says that if you are encountering a bunch of weeds like our prairie weeds, you have the right to take it over and plant corn and soybeans if you want. That attitude has prevailed in a lot of entrepreneurial circles. So he talked about these sorts of things. There were people who harvest walnut trees. Now, one walnut tree that they harvested brought in $27,000. This is because you take the wood. Often, if it's been in a forest, it has a straight barrel for about 30 feet. That makes very good veneer. And so there is a commercial basis for having forests. So we talked to those people. There were Native Plant Society people. There were people who put up little bird boxes for chickadees or other creatures. I'm looking at my list. I did talk to the Kickapoo Trail people. I talked to the people who are supervising. It's called the Farnsworth Group of Engineers. They're supervising the rail trail activities that we were discussing previously. So I talked to them. There were visitors from the Macon County and Champaign County. These were both conservation districts. And that sort of covers some of the variety of people that were presenting. The keynote address was by a couple that would have been working with endangered creatures, and the talk was basically about DDT. That they had often they have animals that have an eye removed or a broken wing or something like that. So they have a bald eagle that was there, and it could spread its wings, and it's almost held in a falconry fashion. But these creatures are docile. They're not the sort of creatures that you can send back into the environment because they were often young, not necessarily attuned to making their own way in the real wildlife world with a disadvantage. So they're used for educational purposes. The talk was basically about DDT because DDT got into the ecosystem, and the eggs that were being produced by the eagles were very, very soft shells. And an eagle is a very huge bird with talons. And so the researchers noticed that there were no juvenile eagles happening, and the reason why was that the DDT was creating these eggs. And there were people like Yannicone and others who started to say to the world at large, this is not appropriate. We have DDT in people's breast milk and DDT in all sorts of places that it shouldn't be in. So gradually this was the first attempt to eliminate DDT in a professional manner, in a legal manner. So people used to more or less dump DDT on trees if there were some sort of thing like a emerald ash borer. You got rid of it with DDT.
Wasn't DDT the main ingredient in the fogging machines that they would run up and down streets in communities to?
Yes.
If you go online, you will find any number of groups where people say, "Gosh, wasn't it fun back in the days when you went down to the local roller rink? My hometown actually had a cow path that people would follow. It actually had been a cow path, but wasn't by the time there were no cows on it anymore by the time I was around. But of course, you'll find any number of photos of kids on their bicycle following along after the fogging machine. And now, of course, we find out that we were dousing ourselves with DDT by following along there.
In actual fact, it was a World War II thing, and it really prevented troops from getting malaria because it got the mosquitoes, but it got everything else too. It got into the fish and the trying the pyramid of so if the eagle is eating fish and the fish have DDT in them, then they're concentrating the DDT. By the time they get to the top of the food chain, it's very deadly DDT. Well, Yannicon and others took that to court, and that was the first time a chemical like that had been checked. It was pointed out that the amount of money put into research on DDT was greater than was put into the Manhattan Project. It was so important to have troops without malaria. So once it was cooled down, then the eggs came back, and the eagles are coming back, and so they were very pleased with that. So that was the keynote address. I applaud the Vermilion County Conservation District for doing this. They got a little $15 book here that relates some of these activities, and they had about 200 slides that went through the history of that 50 years. Not always easy, not always perfect, but a very good attempt. Let me look at my notes here. 15 minutes, okay. Ron Sleater came from Decatur. We went up to Pope Prairie, and Ron herbicided the teasel. Not everyone likes to use herbicide because just for the reason we talked about DDT. But teasel is a mongrel plant. It is a very cherished dried arrangement. It looks neat. It has a bowl which was used to tease wool, thus the name. So it goes into cemeteries in wreaths and then spreads to prairies like we have nearby at Rantoul. So the plant itself, let alone the seed on top, which has 1 million seeds in it, so it produces young ones very quickly. It's tall. It's 10 feet tall. So we try to catch that when it's very early, and we spot herbicide it, which is very effective. And Ron is very good at it. He's been an ADM chemist, and he spends a lot of time. It gets difficult because to have a backpack of herbicide is heavy, and the terrain is not easy to walk. At the same time as Ron was doing that, I was removing autumn olive trees and cypress. Cypress is another invader that comes from the cemetery where there are funereal trees. But every tree I reduced with shears. There were prairie plants underneath that more or less said, "Thank you for liberating them." So they grow differently on the interurban bed, the remnants there. And last night when I came in, Jim Fay had sent a little note to say, "What is this flower?" And it was a rose. So I talked to him about the several roses that we have. But he had been to Pope Prairie, and he'd noticed that the sulfiums, the compass plant, and the dock were fairly dominant. Well, yes. When we took over and bought this prairie, had been used as a gravel pit. And the gravel pit took out about 8 feet of glacial till. It's on the Bloomington Moraine. And the glacial till is good for road pack. So it was taken out and probably sold by the Pope family, which had billboards on a bend that went out around the cemetery, big billboards. But they were obsoleted by the fact that the Route 57 was put in and went around Rantoul, so that the advertising profit was not there. But the gravel was sold, and around it are remnants. And across an old Route 45, it's old concrete road, there are remnants. And where there was an interurban, the same. And on the right-of-way of the main line, there are remnants. So we have a very nice prairie there, and we would like to see it extended all the way to, it exists all the way to Paxton, and we would like perhaps to extend it to Kankakee, where there is loess and sand that has been blown across from glacial meltways in the past. And one of the field trips to for the North American Prairie Conference, which is coming up, is to oak savannas that are on the sand dunes of Kankakee. So evil-minded, we would like to think of taking a historic national park, linear park, off of 57 at Kankakee and driving down those communities where 45 parallels the railroad line, and it's between the road and the railroad line is loaded with prairie. Come down to Loda, where there's a cemetery prairie, down to Paxton, where there's a cemetery prairie, and where we can encounter this old Route 45 that goes down past the Pope Prairie. And then on the south side of the cemetery, there's a swampland, which is very typical of the moraine, the Bloomington Moraine, bleeding off its creeks into the likes of Flatville and an outwash plain. So I talked to Jim about that, and it's one of the sorts of things we do. So that was interesting. Lake Park, purple coneflowers are a joy. They're all on the banks, and I know the reason why. Lake Park is a cutoff of a meander, and the cutoff flows much quicker with high velocity of water than when you take it around a long meander. Groins have been put into of riprap stone to make like little waterfalls so that it slows that erosion. But there was a difficulty in trying to put vegetation on a 45-degree angle. So one of the things we did was put a little blue stem, and we put purple coneflowers, because purple coneflowers have a 4 feet of root and even more, and they help to hold the soil together. The little blue stem probably has a mile of rootlets, and so we've saved a lot of erosion there. But if you go to Lake Park, you'll see the concentration of purple coneflowers is on that embankment. We've had a series of developments around about, and so we've been dumpster diving, and people have been taking things. And I really encourage that a lot of the things we pull out of the dumpster need a wrench or something to repair. There's a recycling here. Sometimes it's costly. I just took a cart that needed a tire, and to help me, the tire costs, and the inner tube costs $60, and I'm sure that I could go buy the go-kart for probably $30. But it's an attempt to replace things rather than to waste things. Some of the buckets that are used for mopping floors often have a wheel that just needs a replacement wheel. So $14 on a replacement wheel will save sending a bucket like that to the landfill, and that bucket may cost $120. It's just strange to see this sort of thing happening. I was going to talk about cheese, but well, let me just finish off about the dumpster diving. There were old-style beer garden events that were tables that had legs that you could move out, and a table that could be folded up, and those things could be saved and interesting. There were planters that the Rubles had on their windows that were no longer needed. They were very attractive, and people salvaged those. And there was steel to hold them up, and so that was salvaged too. Cheese making. I got the Mirror, which is a publication from Farmer City. And Farmer City at one stage was being proselytized for a cheese factory. Before we had wall-to-wall corn and soybeans, we had cattle, beef cattle, dairy cattle, and we had mixed farms. You might have a pea crop or pasture for cattle. And we didn't have soybeans yet because they hadn't been invented by the agronomists. That didn't come in until about 1936. So there were cows, and each farmer would have perhaps 2 or 6 cows for their own use, but there was always an excess. So cheese factories went in, and so the Mirror was outlining the process whereby an entrepreneur came to the city and said, I'd like to put in a cheese factory. I don't want to cost you money to do that. I think we can survive by ourselves, but we would like to know how many farmers be around to provide something like 14,000 gallons of milk with a certain butterfat content. And so they had surveys, and sure enough, they had a cheese factory. And so I was talking to a Mennonite from Fisher, and I said, "What did you do with your milk?" And he says, we used to sell our milk, excess milk, to the Air Force Base. And we were only 10 miles away, and actually the cheese factory had to go at least 20 miles to create to collect enough milk to allow for cheese making. Cheese making allowed for a product that was more likely to be preserved than milk itself. The milk varies according to the cow that you have. If you have a Friesian that produces a lot of milk, often there's not a lot of butterfat in it. But if you have a Jersey which has a high butterfat content, you can merge those milks so that you have an average milk that is justified by agronomy people who are watching the dairy industry and what it does. Eventually, we went to corn and soybeans, and those cheese factories were obsoleted, and we now have to buy our milk from Wisconsin or wherever. 30 seconds. Okay, I think we're getting towards the end, and thanks for listening. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And there goes the watch confirming it's the top of the hour. And you're tuned to WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.